If the power went out tonight and the grocery shelves are empty tomorrow and first responders are not responding for a week, would you rather be one of the millions that are competing for help or one of the few that don't need it? For most people, prepping starts with food, water, and gear, but there's one prep that quietly affects everything else, and that's your location. But before we get into today's video, if you're serious about being a provider and protector for yourself, your family, and your community, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. And with that, let's jump right in. So the first reason why I think you should consider leaving the big city is that cities don't just have risks, they multiply them. You think about all the things that cities depend upon. They depend upon working water and sewage. They depend upon constant food delivery, working electricity. They depend upon the availability of law enforcement. They depend upon also social cooperation. But if you remove any one of these, things deteriorate fast. When that happens, you're relying upon strangers to behave well under stress. You're relying upon an infrastructure that you don't control. You're relying upon law enforcement who are overwhelmed. And history shows us that when systems become strained, density becomes a danger. And more people means more competition, more desperation, and more volatility. In preparedness terms, cities are single points of failure stacked on top of each other. So the second reason to consider leaving the big city is that food insecurity hits cities first. If you think about it, most cities operate on just-in-time delivery for food. And this means that most grocery stores have just a few days of inventory, that the warehouses are typically located outside of the city, that any kind of disruption in the transportation can really come crashing down for everyone. But in rural or more semi-rural areas, people store food naturally. They can hunt, they can have a garden, they can raise animals. Maybe the resupply isn't as immediate, but it's also not as fragile. But in cities, when the shelves go empty, panic spreads quickly, theft increases, and in general, there's more insecurity and safety concerns. And so leaving the city reduces your exposure to mass panic. So the third reason to consider leaving the big city is that crime and civil unrest escalate faster in urban areas. When resources become scarce, typically crime increases and more people are doing things that they would otherwise not do. And police and law enforcement are oftentimes overwhelmed and they simply resort to crowd control instead of individual protection. And if you think about this, if you're a family, let's say you're a dad, and there's no more food, there's no more resources, and you're going to do whatever it takes to provide that food for your children, for your wife. And sometimes that may mean doing something that you would not otherwise normally do. And so this is a big issue for a lot of people that are in cities, that all of a sudden, if something happens and the resources go dry, then they're going to resort to something else that is dangerous. In contrast, rural areas have fewer targets, homes are spread out more, and of course, criminals would have to travel farther to get to you. And statistically, high-density stress environments fail faster. And so distance is a form of defense. So the fourth reason to consider leaving the big city is that self-sufficiency is a lot easier outside of the city. So let's say you live in an apartment downtown in a big city somewhere. It's going to be a lot harder to store up months of food, to have maybe alternate forms of electricity and power, maybe to have alternate ways to get clean water. It's going to be very, very difficult if you live in that kind of environment if something happened. Now compare that to a rural home somewhere, a homestead even, and you've got space, you got flexibility, you have options, and you also have privacy. And when you think about living in a more rural area, you can have that garden, you can have the various space that you need to store up all those emergency supplies. And I think prepping works best when it's visible to you, but not everybody else. So I think the sixth reason to consider leaving the big city is the difference between community and crowds. Cities have crowds, but oftentimes preparedness thrives on community. So a community is one in which people know each other, they are depending upon one another, they're helping one another out. It's not just a crowd, it's actually a community of serving and helping one another and seeing those mutual skills that they could be using to survive. But in big cities, I've noticed that people really don't talk to each other much, that there's low trust of each other, and anonymity has replaced accountability. But in a true crisis, relationships matter more than resources, and living outside those high-density urban areas brings you closer to that community. All right, so the seventh reason to consider leaving the big city is for your own mental and spiritual health. The crowding, the stress, the constant noise, cities just wear people down, even in good times. But having that space gives you a quiet, it gives you the peace of mind, it gives you a sense of perspective and even control. There's something so peaceful about walking out of your home in the country at night and seeing the stars and just walking around on your property after dinner, or being with your children and fishing from your pond or something like that. There's something very peaceful about it. And I would venture to say that a lot of people that are thinking about leaving the big city, this is maybe the top priority for them. But I do want to provide one clarification. Leaving the big city doesn't mean that you have to go off-grid. Leaving the city doesn't mean that you have to give up modern conveniences, or that you have to go and live in the wilderness, or that you have to become isolated. And I think preparedness exists on a spectrum, and not everyone is going to be comfortable going completely off-grid. And I'm not suggesting that here today. But there's a range of it, and some people would love to have that, love to have a completely off-grid system with alternate forms of electricity like solar or other forms of getting clean water, having their own garden and animals and all of those things, that they're not relying upon others for the goods and services for the things that they need at all. However, that's not everybody, and that's okay. And so you don't have to think of leaving the city of just, going barefoot in the country all of a sudden. No, it doesn't have to be that at all. But I do believe that every mile away from that density, those high density areas, is a reduction in risk. I do believe that location is also a prep. It's more than just your food, your water, your emergency communications, your first aid. You also need to think about the location as well. In fact, you might argue that where you live shapes every other prep that you have. So leaving the city reduces competition, it increases self-sufficiency, it improves security, it strengthens community, and it lowers stress. You don't have to move tomorrow, but I do think you should be thinking about it today. Well, guys, I hope this has been helpful for you today. What would you do? Would you leave the big city, or are you already gone? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this down in the comments below. But thanks so much for your support for us and for our channel. If you've not already done so, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to our channel, and we'll see you on the next video.